Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Mackenzie Eaglin. I'm a resident scholar here at AEI, and I'm most pleased to have the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, here with us this morning. He's following up our series with the Joint Chiefs last year in 2014 and with our Service Secretary series this year. And I think we couldn't have a better speaker on such a questionably rainy morning, and I appreciate all of you making the time and effort to get here. The man needs little introduction, so I'm not going to overspend time on his resume because you're here because you already know who he is and you want to hear from him. But as you know, he is the Secretary of the Navy. He leads the Department of the Navy, which includes, of course, the Marine Corps. About 900,000 people in uniform and civilian. Secretary Mabus also served in the Navy aboard a cruiser during his time after graduate school. We all know him as a world traveler, truly, in his capacity as secretary, visiting over 130 countries and territories during his now over 6 years in the job. He's taken some initiatives. He will clearly leave a legacy as somebody who cares about making the Navy and the Marine Corps a more environmentally friendly service, leading the way, in fact, for the other services, all the way down to demonstrating the Great Green Fleet in 2012, something I followed very closely. Revitalizing shipbuilding, something very near and dear to the hearts of myself and my colleagues here at AEI, Tom Donnelly and others in the Maryland Ware Center for Security Studies, has been a major priority of Secretary Mabus. We've long said quantity has a quality all of its own, and I believe the Secretary shares that sentiment. He's a former governor of Mississippi and has held other jobs in the private sector, ambassador to Saudi Arabia as well. And again, he needs no introduction, but we're looking forward to hearing from him this morning. And please join me in welcoming Secretary Mabus.
Well, thank y'all all very much. And Mackenzie, thank you so much for inviting me and for that introduction. What I was going to start out by saying is I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm gonna do my Navy 101, and then I'll be happy to take questions and get into a conversation. My Chief of Staff, Tom Opel, was my communications director when I was governor. And one of his favorite sayings is, repetition is the key to good communications. And he tells the story that during my campaign for governor, after I'd won the Democratic nomination, our field director came to him and said, "We got to have another speech." And he said, "Why? We just won." And she said, "Because I've heard it about 400 times and I'm sick of it." And he said, "Okay." He said, Mabus says there are three things that government ought to do well. Name them. He said it in every single speech. It's what he leads with. And she said, "Well, there's education. And there's education." She said, "I don't remember the other two." And he said, "We're not changing the speech." So what the Navy and Marine Corps uniquely give America is presence. Being not only in the right place at the right time, but the right place all the time. Being around the globe, around the clock. And this naval presence, this importance of having a Navy, is enshrined in our Constitution. It says, the Constitution, Article 1, says that Congress shall have the power to raise an army, but it is mandated to maintain a Navy. And that not so subtle difference is the difference in the two services. One chief of Navy in Asia told me that the difference between soldiers and sailors was that soldiers looked at maps, they looked at boundaries, they looked at lines, they looked down. They saw obstacles. That sailors looked out. They didn't see any lines, they didn't see any boundaries, they saw the horizon. They wanted to see what was coming over that horizon. And so to give that presence that is the reason for our existence. The way I've tried to organize my thinking about Navy and how we deal with it and the way the Navy deals with it is with 4 fundamentals: people, platforms, power, and partnerships. I'm going to hit 3 of them sort of at the wave tops: people, power, and partnerships. Because, as Mackenzie said, one of the things I've focused on most is platforms, is growing the fleet. And I want to talk about that in a little more detail. But people, our sailors, our Marines, our civilians, we've got the best force we've ever had. But we have put them under a lot of stress over the past decade or more. And unlike other services, we deploy equally in peacetime and in wartime. There are no permanent homecomings for sailors and Marines. So we've tried to take steps to mitigate this. We're trying to make deployments more standard. We're trying to have some more family-friendly programs. We don't have enough women in the Navy. So I've said in a speech in Annapolis 3 weeks ago, we need to at least double maternity leave, paid maternity leave. We're going to open child care facilities 2 hours earlier, leave them open 2 hours later. We're going to promote based more on merit than on year group. We're going to give COs the ability to promote meritoriously up to 5% of the force, of the enlisted force, without waiting for the next test or the next scheduled round of advancements. We're also trying to unlock the great innovation that's out there in the fleet. I've stood up a thing called Task Force Innovation, which is almost an oxymoron, that you stand up a task force to innovate. But what we're trying to do is get the ideas that come out of the fleet and take the good ones and do them fleet-wide. So we've got a website now that we call the Hatch that is a crowdsourcing idea. And we're getting an amazing number of ideas coming in. There's a debate on them. People vote on them. And it bubbles up to me, to the CNO. We've begun to fund some of these ideas. I funded one last week at Explosive Ordnance Disposal School to go from paper training materials to iPads and smartphones, because the main reason people were washing out was academics. It wasn't, they couldn't do the physical part of it. So what we're trying to do is make the service a place that you can stay in longer, that we keep the skill set that we need, that we're expanding pretty dramatically, or we're asking Congress to expand pretty dramatically the career and mission program, so that you can take up to 3 years off for any reason. Now, you've got to give us back 2 years for every year you take off. But when you come back, you will compete against people from 3 years earlier, not the people who've still been in the fleet for 3 years. We want to make it easier to move between reserve and active duty. We want to make it easier to do things like have a family, or without making the choice of whether to continue in the military. Or the best example of this was Jim Amos, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who took off 2.5 years to fly airplanes for a commercial airline and came back in. And as part of that, one of the things that I've established is called the Secretary of the Navy's Industry Tour. We're going to take some of our best mid-level officers and send them for a year or two to some of the great companies in America, and tell them to bring back best practices to Navy. I think they will also take some best practices to those companies. So that's people. Power, as Mackenzie said, if you want to see how power can be used as a weapon, fuel, energy can be used as a weapon, just read about what Russia did going into Crimea, read what Russia is doing to the Ukraine today, read what Russia is doing to Europe today about their oil and gas supplies. And my notion was we shouldn't have that weapon turned against us. And so in 2009, I came up with goals for the Navy, and the biggest one of which was that by no later than 2020, at least half of all our energy would come from non-fossil fuel sources, to have a more stable supply and a more stable price for those supplies. We're going to be there by the end of this year in terms of our shore bases. And we're saving money doing it. And next we're going to start working on microgrids so that we can pull ourselves off the grid if something happens to the commercial grid. We can pull ourselves off so we can still do our military job. And we're not only changing the type of fuel we're using, we're also using less of it. And we're trying to make fuel where we are. And the reason for that is in Afghanistan, for example, the Marines at the height of the fighting were losing one Marine killed or wounded for every 50 convoys of fuel we brought in to that country. And so if you can make fuel where you are, we gave Marines in Sangin, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, at the height of the fighting there, some solar blankets. They're about this big. You roll them up, you stick them in your pack, and you power your radios, your GPSs off of those. It saved a company of Marines 700 pounds that they didn't have to carry. And it also meant they didn't have to be resupplied. We've got SEAL teams now that are getting close to net zero in terms of both energy and water, that they can stay out for a long, long time. But we're also using less energy. A chief in 2003 made the recommendation, and it took until last year for this to be put into effect. Change the light bulbs on ships. We're doing that now. By changing the light bulbs from incandescent to LEDs, saves about 3% of the total energy of that ship. We're doing that. We're doing things like hull coatings and stern flaps. We're doing voyage planning. And we're using significantly less energy. We're building hybrid ships, electric drives for speeds under 12 knots, marine diesel for speeds over 12 knots. And because of that, the first one of these ships we built, which is the Macon Island, a big deck amphib, after its first deployment, it brought almost half its fuel budget home with it. So that's power. Partnerships. I do travel a lot. My wife says I need a name tag when I come home. I think she's joking. I travel for two reasons. One is to see sailors and Marines where they are deployed. Sort of hang out in the Pentagon on the off chance they may come by and visit with me. But the second reason is to visit with our partners and our allies around the world, to make sure that we're doing the training, make sure we're doing the exercises together, make sure we're doing the operations together that will translate into a time of crisis, that we know how each other operates, we know how we work, we have an understanding, we have a trust between two countries or more. And the other partnerships that we have, beside the international partnerships, we have a partnership with industry. We don't build the things that we use. We have to be close with industry. I think we owe industry certain things. We owe them stable designs. Don't build ship while you're designing it. We owe them mature technology. If you've got something, that a gee whiz weapon that is almost ready but not quite, put it on the next ship, put it on the next block. Don't try to force it in on this one. And we owe them certainty. How many ships are you going to build? How many aircraft are you going to build? When are you going to build them? In exchange, they owe us certain things. If they know how many ships we're going to build or how many aircraft, they need to do the infrastructure improvements to do that. They need to do the job training for the people that are going to build it. And if we don't change the design, every single ship or every single aircraft of the same type ought to cost less than the one before it, because there ought to be a learning curve. And the final partnership is with the American people. We're America's away team. We don't ever have a home game. When sailors and Marines are doing their job, they're usually a long, long way from home. And the American people, because they never see them, or don't see them very much, don't understand enough just how hard the jobs we ask them to do, just how much we expect them to be able to do it day in and day out, just how flexible they have to be, and just how good they are at getting these jobs done. Again, year in, year out, day in, day out. And finally, platforms. It's one of my favorite quotes. Quantity has a quality all its own. On 9/11, 2001, the U.S. Navy stood at 316 ships. By 2008, after one of the huge military buildups in our history, we were down to 278 ships. In the 5 years before I took office as Secretary, we put 27 ships under contract. That was not enough to stop the slide in the size of the fleet, and was not enough to keep our shipyards going. In my first 5 years as Secretary, we have put 70 ships under contract, and we've done it with a smaller top line. We've done it using just sort of some basic business practices: competition, fixed price contracts, multi-years or block buys. Now, I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. Last summer, the Navy signed the biggest contract in our history for 10 Virginia-class attack submarines, built over the next 5 years. We're getting 10, we're paying for 9. It's like having one of those little punch cards. Buy 9 subs, get a 10th free. And we're doing that because they can buy, the shipyards, the 2 shipyards that build these submarines can buy all their equipment in economic order quantities. They can have the workforce they need, and it's stable. They have predictability, and it saves us about $2 billion. The other example I'll give you is the DDG-51, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. That's the surface combatant, the large surface combatant that we build. We've got 2 shipyards, Bath, Maine, and Pascagoula, Mississippi, that build these. And we want them both to stay open for a lot of reasons, one of which is competition. But there really wasn't any competition because we were building 2 a year, and so each one got one, and they took it sort of as an allocation. And the prices just kept going up. So 2 years ago, we decided to try something different. So we bid out 3 ships. And we said the low bid gets the 3rd ship. And oh, by the way, the difference in the high bid and the low bid is going to come out of the high bidder's profit. Well, one shipyard absolutely crushed the other one in that. Last year, because Congress authorized a multi-year, we bid out 9 ships with an option for a 10th. Again, the low bid got 5. The high bid would get 4, and the option was sort of a swing ship. And again, the difference in the high bid and the low bid came out of the high bidder's profit. The other shipyard won dramatically, which shows the value of competition. We're saving about $300 million per ship on these destroyers now because of it. And we're not doing this at the expense of air. We're also buying 40% more aircraft in the first 5 years that I've been there than in the 5 years preceding. And you've got to have those big gray hulls on the horizon. You've got to have that presence. You've got to have it to give our leaders options. Now, it's up to the president and the national leadership as to what to do with those options. But they've got to have the full range of options. And you've got to have those hulls around the world. They don't do much good sitting at home. And to do that, you've got to have a defined maintenance schedule. You've got to have a defined training schedule. You've got to be far more comprehensive than we have been in the past, because we have used up a lot of our readiness in terms of steaming, in terms of training, in terms of deferring maintenance, because we don't reset like the Marines do or like the Army does. We reset in stride. Our reset is called maintenance. To have those ships and to have them where they need to be. Because one of the things, I talked about Russia and Crimea, and one of the things that, most of our thinking is on phases in war. One of the things that they showed is that there are no phases anymore. It's phase everything from the word go. It's cyber, it's kinetic attacks, it's disinformation. And it's also, if assets aren't close, they may not get into the fight. So we're changing the way we use the fleet as well. We're putting more destroyers into Yokosuka, Japan. We're putting another submarine into Guam. We're putting 4 littoral combat ships into Singapore. Now, we're crewing the LCSs differently. We're flying the crews in. Crews change out every 4 months. The ships stay basically where they are. We're not home porting them in Singapore, but we're forward stationing them there for a good while. On the other side of the world, we're moving 4 DDGs. We have 3 there now. The last one gets there this fall into Rota, Spain. Their primary mission is to do ballistic defense work around Europe, but they have lots of secondary uses. They're available to do lots of things. And as CNO, I don't know if he said it here, but he says it often, every ship forward stationed, so in Japan, in Rota, in Singapore, represents 4 back here because of transit time, because of repair times, because of maintenance, because of that sort of thing. So we have as many ships forward today as we did 20 years ago when our fleet was 100 more ships. I'm going to protect shipbuilding, regardless of what happens in the budget. But the problem you've got to understand is that if you protect shipbuilding, because I'm not going to pay for one ship with another ship. The easy thing is, well, take a carrier strike group, take an amphibious ready group, because they're big, they're visible, you know how much they cost. But that's pretty much a losing game. But if you do protect shipbuilding, something else is going to break if sequester hits again, for example. When sequester and the government shutdown hit in 2013, you couldn't see many of the immediate impacts. You could see some, but not many of the immediate ones. Our shipyards, our public shipyards, because of the hiring freeze that was imposed, because of the furloughs that were imposed, because of the slowdown that was imposed, it's going to take until 2019 to get rid of the backlog of our ships that can't go through there to get their yard availabilities, to get their maintenance done. Our aircraft depot, which are all public, are pretty much the same way. It'll take till 2019 or 2020 to catch up on the refurbishments of our aircraft. So protecting one, which I think is crucial, if sequester hits, break something else. And I'll do one more minute about the budget, and then I'll take questions. The easy thing, the very, very easy thing is, like I said, take a BCT from the Army, take an air wing from the Air Force, take a carrier strike group from the Navy when times get tough. That's the easy thing, that affects the warfighter very directly. What we ought to be a lot better at is doing overhead, things that don't affect the warfighter, things that don't add value. I'll give you a purely Navy version. Out of a roughly $160 billion budget, 3 years ago, we were spending $40 billion a year on personal services contracts. That's everything from IT to mowing the grass. At the time, we couldn't tell you from the day Congress appropriated $1 how that dollar got to where it was going or what it was used for exactly. We can now. We've been able to tag those dollars. We can follow them through. And we've done some other things. The biggest one of which, we've set up something we call contract courts. I'm not sure what the official name is, but every year, every contracting officer's got to bring in their contracts. They got to defend them. Do you still need this? When was the last time you competed it? We're saving already 10%, so $4 billion a year doing that. I think we're going to do better at it. That's, by the way, more than 2 Virginia-class submarines that we're saving right there. And if you want to look at real money, 20% of the Pentagon budget, 20%, $1 out of every 5 is spent on the fourth estate, not the media, but the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the defense agencies, the organizations run by the undersecretaries. Pure overhead. Pure overhead. And they've grown far faster than the services, even in the time of the Iraq and the Afghan war. And I'll give you one last example, and then I'll quit. There's a thing called DFAS, Defense Finance and Accounting Service. They write our checks. We tell them who to write the checks to, we tell them how much to write them for, and they write the checks. Last year, they charged us $300 million to write the checks. And, I mean, we've got our own finance system, we've got our own accounting system, and as y'all are aware, the Pentagon's the last place that hadn't been audited. The Marines got a clean audit. Marines in 13, the audit for 14 is, they got a clean audit 12, the audit for 13 is ongoing there, and the audit for 14 is beginning. Navy is beginning the audit for 14. We may not even have a shot at a clean opinion because DFAS cannot tell us how they spent our money. 9 out of 10 of their internal controls have been found not to be effective. We cannot count on their data that we gave them. Do you really need this? So I think there are other places to look than taking tools from the warfighter. There are other places to look. Now, they're harder to find, they're harder to get to, but they can they can return a lot of money, and we can put more into tooth and less into tail. United States Navy, United States Marine Corps, the greatest expeditionary fighting force the world has ever known. And it is up to us to keep it that way. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Secretary Mabus. That you covered a lot of ground, and I want to be a moderator hog. I really do, and I could talk to you for a couple hours up here, but we will open it up for questions in just a moment. But I want to thank you for that thoughtful 101, that overview. I don't even honestly know where to begin, but I've had my own personal experiences with some of these points that you've raised, working for the Senator from Maine, DFAS, Bath Iron Works, a lot of these things. But actually, I want to refer back to another group with whom I've worked, the QDR Independent Panel back in 2010, the predecessor to the National Defense Panel of 2014. One of the members of that panel was a former Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, among many others. Bipartisan commission designed to stress test the Pentagon's first budget under President Obama and his defense strategy. One of the major recommendations of that group is in the Senate Armed Services Committee version of the Defense Policy Bill moving. And it was basically it was looking at acquisition reform and all of the challenges therein, pretty much since the inception of the department. I mean, this is not new to you. You've been trying to undo some of these problems yourself. But this group identified some problems with lack of clear accountability and line authority and management, if you will, and said it's time for the service chiefs to have a more clear role or resurrected role in the defense acquisition process, whether that's the purchase of hardware or services. But typically the focus is on hardware, as you know, and platforms. What are your thoughts on that recommendation as it's posed by, let's just say by the panel, as opposed to the bill that's moving, because you may have different thoughts about that. They are slightly different in their thoughts, but or what does the CNO think about that? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? How do you feel about your role in the acquisition process and going forward?
Number one, I think it's a good thing in either version. The service chiefs now, early in the process, help set some of the requirements. But then in practice, I think they're in it. I know they're in it in the Navy and Marine Corps, but it's a matter of personalities in practice rather than mandates. Because, I mean, we do move forward with a lot of discussion, a lot of interaction with them. But the way the law is written, they help set the requirements and they don't come back in until the things are being delivered. That's just not a very good way to run a railroad. And part of my testimony this year, and some of the reporters here that covered it, I took a chart, an acquisition chart, what you've got to do to get a major system through. Looks like a plate of spaghetti. I mean, it doesn't matter how big you blow this thing up, you can't read it, and you can't follow it. I mean, it's just gate reviews and this and that and this other thing, and it's form over substance. It slows it down. It takes forever to get from the lab to the warfighter. And usually when Congress says we want to help you with acquisition reform, you sort of cower, duck. But I think in this case, they're on to something. Good. And if they can simplify this acquisitions process, and again, each service has its own acquisition executive, its own acquisition process. DOD has one sitting over the top of it. And there's a lot of duplication that goes on there. I also read an AEI,
Tom
Donnelly's piece about testing.
Yes.
Tom Opal, guy that's not now my chief of staff has a saying, testing proved that testing works. And, you know, we had sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars to do tests. It's unclear what the tests tell us. And it's also unclear on things like LCS. LCS is a small surface combatant. It's not a large ship. It's a multi-mission ship. But part of its role in terms of being survivable is not getting hit. And we, in a war, are never going to send it out there by itself. So it's going to be part of a much bigger group. But to test it independently and say, you got to make it this survivable, X, Y, Z, means you need a destroyer. And LCS is, the hulls coming off the line today cost about $350 million. Destroyer cost about $1.5 billion. So I've got some, we've got to make the acquisition process simpler, and there's got to be more accountability. And I'll quit, but when I'm testifying, when the CNO, when the commandant's testifying, and senators or congressmen want to know, why is this running over? Why is this system not performing the way it should? And a lot of times we don't have control of it. And so there's no responsibility, there's no accountability involved. Last example I'll give is that 2 or 3 years ago, all the military medicine, the hospitals in the National Capital Region were put under unified authority in the Pentagon. They were taken away from the service secretaries, Bethesda taken away from Navy, Walter Reed taken away from Army. I guarantee you, if something happens, something bad happens at Bethesda or Walter Reed, they're going to come looking for me. They're going to come looking for John McHugh. They're not going to come looking for the Assistant Secretary for Health Affairs at the Pentagon. And I'm very happy to and very willing to accept that responsibility, that accountability, but give me the responsibility.
Do you think the next, and some days the extent of acquisition reform in the defense authorization bill is just exhaustive. And in some ways, I am worried we've over-reformed the defense acquisition reform process over many, many decades. I feel in many ways this effort is actually pretty decent. Some new initiatives, trying to unwind and undo some things of the past, which is helpful. I'd like personally for Congress to say, check, let's let the system go forward as it is with this set of acquisition reform on the hardware platform equipment side in particular, and focus on the service contracting. And it was such a breath of fresh air to hear you talk about that specifically, not just DFAS, but others. And your point about 3 years ago and where you are today and identifying. Today, the Defense Department's like any other major company. The majority of what the Defense Department purchases is services. Services is labor. That means people. That's it. It's that simple. In some cases, it means IT or commodities. But for the most part, it's just labor. So you're seeming to lead the way in service contracting acquisition reform. Is there an area for Congress to be helpful in this? Is it just for them to wake up to that this is an area that needs focus as opposed to over-reforming the purchase of equipment and hardware?
I think that's part of it, because it is easier to do the hardware. Right. It's way easier. But I also think there are ways that they can, number one, don't assume all four services, all three departments have the same needs. Give us some flexibility, because sometimes our requirements are very different from the others, and as it should be. Number two is when you mandate reductions in headcount, for example, make sure it actually happens, because I'll tell you what happens now. And again, I'm talking about the Fourth Estate, but cut 20%. Well, number one, some of those folks got replaced with contractors right away. But number two, some of them got replaced because they had the services detail folks to them. So the headcount's still ours. They're doing work somewhere else. Make certain that happens. And to the extent you can, and this is hard, to the extent you can, protect the stuff that actually gets to the warfighter. And not don't protect the form, protect the function. Secretary Gates showed you could get stuff out there quick with the MRAP. Now what he had to do was bypass the entire acquisition process. And the way he did it was just with money. And particularly today, that's not possible, but you've got to have a way that for urgent needs, you get around it. And we've done workarounds, but you need that more ingrained. And I'm sort of hopeful about this acquisition reform. As I said, most of the time when Congress says we want to help,
Agree.
they add to that spaghetti plate.
That's right.
But this one, I think, recognizes that
Yes.
that it's gone too far one way, and I hope they're bringing it back the other.
Agree. Thank you. Last quick question. You talked about a reset in stride, and I translated that to reset in motion in my own mind. I get it. So, and the CNO's point about one ship forward gives you basically the capability of 4 ships, and he's right. I'm just curious, maybe for those thinking about the maintenance and the reset, particularly Congress, when they think about jobs in the U.S., and a lot of the maintenance work is done by DoD civilians, depot workers, shipyard maintainers, overhaul. When the ship is forward and the crews are rotating, I assume the work is done, the maintenance is done in place as well, because the ship still needs maintenance. Can you walk us quickly through how that is done and who's used to help you do that, and if that's a useful system as it exists today, or will that always be the plan? Will you need to get some more ships back here for the maintenance?
Well, number one, for major things, for major overhauls and things, usually the ships come back, no matter where they are. I mean, that's happening today with the George Washington, the carrier that's in Japan. It's coming back to be refueled and do its complex overhaul. The Reagan's going out to replace it. For LCS, for example, it's a brand new ship. We're still using some contractors to do some of the stuff, some of the repair. That's beginning to transition to sailors doing more of it. We'll do some in the shipyards there, but we always do that. We do voyage repairs. Ships need almost constant maintenance and upkeep, and so we've always done that. Plus, we have filled up our shipyards here.
It's a good problem.
They're running pretty well now. I said the public shipyards have got a backlog. The public aircraft depot have got a backlog, and so if you want to look at it a little different way in terms of jobs, 38 million jobs in America are directly dependent on trade that goes by sea. And I'll make the argument that the world economy is doing as well as it is because of the United States Navy and Marine Corps, because we've kept those sea lanes open, and we've kept them open for everybody. And that's unique in history when you've had a dominant naval power. 90% of all trade goes by water. 95% of all data goes under the water. And so protecting that trade is crucial, not only to our economy and to the jobs here, but to the world economy.
If only you could unlock those ports and the backlog on the West Coast ports, that would, I'm just kidding. We'll leave that to somebody else. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. We do have a microphone or two going around, so if you could just please let us know your name and affiliation, David. We'll start with Sydney, then Otter, then Megan.
All right, Sydney knows my...
Yes, he knows. That's why he's in the front row.
Yeah.
I may even be able to remember the 4 Ps if you challenged me, like the 3 things from your campaign speech. Oh.
First question gets a coin.
Oh, excellent. Lucky guy.
But I can't catch anything.
That's an all hands
Right.
tradition.
Oh, don't worry, I won't leave it there. I've heard you speak on many occasions about the Fourth Estate in DOD and some of the redundant overhead. I don't think I've ever heard you come right off the line of calling for the abolition of a defense agency, which I think you pretty much did here. So let me ask a multi-pronged question. One, are you suggesting we should look at abolishing DFAS? Are there any other DoD fourth agencies you would like to see potentially go away? And have you talked to OSD about this plan of yours yet to get rid of their agencies?
Ah, Sydney. He's going to wake you up.
Yep. Here's the way I'll frame it. Nice try, Sydney, on getting me into deep trouble. But I think we should take a look at whether we need certain functions. I do. I think whether we need some of the same function, whether we need none of the same function. There is a quote that you've heard me use. It's attributed to Yogi Berra. I don't know if he said it or not. It's a pretty good quote. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. In theory, you ought to be able to do stuff DoD-wide. And it should save. You should be able to consolidate stuff. In practice, it just doesn't work very well. And I had experience with this as governor. In theory, putting agencies together, doing government reorganization, ought to save people, ought to save money. Never does. Never does. It usually adds just layers of bureaucracy. And you end up with more people, you end up spending more, and you end up with these huge agencies. So I think you do need to take a look at all these overhead functions. The theory is that Defense Logistics Agency can buy fuel cheaper if they buy it for everybody at once. Well, the thing of it is, we use different aircraft fuel than the Air Force because we operate in a maritime environment and they don't. We buy different fuel for our ships than anybody else. So it's really not these big bulk fuel purchases. It's service-specific fuel purchases. So the theory behind DLA is great. The practice behind DLA, it's unclear if it saves us anything. We're still paying way more than we would pay if we just went out on the street for oil and gas today, but because a lot of that's going into a working capital fund to build up for the next time oil prices go up. So I think you ought to take a look at every one of these. And look, we shouldn't be immune. The services shouldn't be immune from this. You ought to take a look at how we're doing these things. But we have a finance arm. We have an acquisition arm. We have a personnel arm. And there's a lot of duplication going on here. So yeah, I think you ought to look at the Fourth Estate more, but you should look at us too. If the duplication, if you can end the duplication by making some of the service functions smaller, that's fine too.
There's a long history, though, of the Navy Department not liking being part of DoD at all, dating back to 47. The Navy Department saying, you know, we're better off doing this ourselves, and the Army and the Air Force as an Army offshoot being very fond of, let's put everything in one big, well, 5-sided building, for example, to take the origins of it.
Took the Marines a long time to move over there.
Yeah, that's true.
What tends to be the case, or at least it has been in my experience, is if you, and again, this was in an AEI paper, I think it was in Donnelly's piece. If you do things DoD-wide, it usually goes to the lowest and slowest common denominator. Whereas if you let the services compete, if you will, you tend to get things faster. You tend to get things done quicker. And the world is getting smaller and quicker and cheaper. The world, with the exception too often of the Department of Defense.
Agree. All right, we'll go quickly right there, and then I promise we'll hit you three.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to ask you about foreign arms sales. There's been a huge number of arms sales over the past couple of years, including many. There's been a huge increase in sort of arms sales from the U.S. as part of an instrument of foreign policy. As a former ambassador yourself, I just want to see what you think the sort of trend line is going to be. Do you see increases in arms sales going forward because of the increased aggression in Russia and sort of buildup in China? And where do you see sort of particular important areas from the Navy's point of view in terms of building those partnerships? And then finally, I'll just close with a specific question. For many, many years now, Saudi Arabia has been talking about modernizing its Eastern Fleet. And I wonder if you can give us an update where that is. We've seen the first of that big package come out. When is the next piece going to come?
Well, there are a lot of reasons to do arms sales, Andrew, as you know. One of them is for us to be interoperable with other militaries. One example is the Aegis system in Navy. The fact that South Korea uses the Aegis system, Japan uses the Aegis system, we use the Aegis system. If there's a missile shoot from North Korea, we all are getting the same information, and we can all respond in a coordinated way to that. And so it's in our national interest in terms of how we operate with people, how easily we can deal with people, to have as much interoperability as we possibly can. I think the trend lines show that. I mean, one of the problems with our acquisition process is our equipment tends to be more expensive because it just takes longer to field. And so we get out of the price range of some folks. But even if we're out of the price range in terms of, say, hulls, systems sometimes we're not, like the Aegis system. And so I do think that those, I hope those trend lines continue, because it does make working together, it does make confronting a common challenge far easier. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I was ambassador when they did SNEP 1, Saudi Naval Expansion Program 1. They've been talking about SNEP 2, as you know, for a long, long time. I think that with the recent events off Yemen, with Iranian convoy coming in, and with the fact the Saudi oil fields are nearly all in the eastern part of the country, nearly all very close to the Arabian Gulf, with the advent of small boats, of swarming tactics, of things like that, they've gotten more serious about actually moving forward. I can't give you any timelines or anything, but I think that they're concentrating more. But Saudi Arabia is not alone in countries that have concentrated on land power and have now had to look to the sea, because this is such a maritime century, and because the threats are becoming more maritime, not less.
Do you see then additional Aegis systems being sold? Would you see that? Is that something that you would like to see from your vantage point? To see those Aegis systems sold to other countries?
It depends on the country, but yeah.
Otto and Megan.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Otto Kreischer, Sea Power Magazine. Among the initiatives that you really announced earlier this year was more unmanned systems. Okay, perhaps the biggest unmanned system that you've got on your plate is the U-class coming.
We got to get a better name
Yeah.
for that.
You do.
Congress is a little unhappy, particularly John McCain, with the way you have been approaching the U-class definition as to what it's going to be. They keep wanting, they want you to do more testing with the current U-class system, but they want you to define what you want out of the next system. And particularly, they would like more of a strike package than the recon that you seem to be oriented to. What's the progress on that?
Well, I'll take issue a little bit with the form of the question, Otto. We've had an RFP ready to go for a year and a half, 2 years now, and it's been held up because of a look at overall ISR systems. Now, I don't think Navy sees U-class as ISR only. I mean, that's certainly one role, but it's got a lot more roles. And one of the reasons we'd like to go ahead and get the RFP out is that we'd like to find out what's available out there in industry. We've put certain key parameters in terms of endurance, in terms of stealth, in terms of payload. But we don't know what industry, how far they can go in these. And payload is obviously strike. The way I've always seen U-class is as a bridge between where we are today and a full-up, not just strike UAV, but autonomous strike UAV in contested areas. I mean, what U-class would be is it will have strike capability, but it will be in less contested areas, and it probably wouldn't be autonomous. But I think we're going toward, I said in that same talk that you're mentioning, that I thought the F-35, as much as we wanted it, as much as we needed it, would almost certainly be the last manned strike fighter aircraft we ever bought. And so we would like to get going very much on U-class. We are still testing UCAS, the X-47B. We've done air-to-air refueling now. We've done a lot of the things. We've shown you can move it around the deck. We've obviously shown you can take off and land from a carrier. The issue is how you continue to do that without giving one manufacturer just a huge advantage over what comes next. And I think there are ways around that, but we've got to be careful not to give the people that made UCAS a huge advantage of what the next iteration is. Finally, I'll say that's the most visible one, but we're doing a lot of stuff. The Sea Air Space speech that I made, I held up, a little UAV that was about this big. You can print it on 3D printing on board the ship. Cost a couple $100. You send out 2,000 or 3,000 of these if you get in a fight. And they form their own network. I think you're beginning to see things like that. You're beginning to see swarming unmanned surface platforms out there. You're beginning to see big advances in unmanned underwater stuff. That's the future. That's the future of warfare. And as I've said before, the good news is it's relatively cheap and pretty easy to do. The bad news is it's relatively cheap and pretty easy to do. We're not the only ones working on this stuff.
Well, to be respectful of the Secretary's time, we'll take one last and fast question, please, from Megan, very, very quickly, and we'll wrap up. The Secretary's been kind enough to say he'll stay for just a few quick minutes afterwards if you didn't get your question in.
Hi, sir. Megan Eckstein with U.S. Naval Institute News. To follow up on your comments on the forward stationed and forward deployed forces, the GAO recently reported that there are some concerns about material readiness of those, I guess of all ships, but particularly those that are forward. And I wondered, as you look to implement the OFRP, is that enough to address that problem? Is there still more that the Navy needs to do for the forward forces?
The OFRP she's talking about is the Optimized Fleet Response Plan. And as I've said before, if I can track down the people that name these things, I'll do something bad to them. But the Optimized Fleet Response Plan is a plan of basically 36 months of when you do maintenance, when you do workup, when you do the training, when you deploy, and when you're the surge force and you keep a high state of readiness before you start the cycle back again. We're trying to do that to get better material readiness. We are behind on some ships. We've made a lot of progress on that. Gary Ruffhead, when he was CNO, did some very specific things on surface combatants to make sure they were their material readiness. One of the issues that we've got, because our deployments are getting longer and because they're being extended, is when we come back, we don't have enough time to reset, to do the deep maintenance that you need to do. And it is a concern to us, but we think that with the optimized fleet response plan, along with some other things that we're doing, that we're going to be in a position to get the lifespan of those ships that you expect out of those ships when they enter the fleet.
I know I speak for many of us when I say that we could easily talk to you for another hour. So thank you again for coming today, and thank you for entertaining our questions and being so gracious.
Good.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mr.